I drove a Cadillac. Well, he had it all.
Well, hello again. Welcome into 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. Welcome into another edition of Strategies for Living. I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan. Look at there.
Hi, Dave.
Grinning like a Chessy cat.
I missed you.
I missed you too. You did a good job last night.
Well, thanks to Ruben. He kind of coaxed me through it.
PLPC Carla McCormick, and you've mentioned our ace producer. He is Rapid Ruben White.
Right. Whichever.
Yeah, well,
whichever's easiest to say.
What is going on with me here lately? I mean, you know, the other night, I came to you and I looked at you and the mind just went blank. And then tonight I'm calling you Ruben White, and I know your daddy. I know
Robert J.
Robert J. Yeah,
Right.
Well, anyway, you both did such a good job last night.
Thank you.
You really
it was
did.
fun. Noelle is a great host, and what she's doing with Renesting Project is so cool.
Folks, welcome into Strategies for Living. We are brought to you by CADA, the Council on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse of Northwest Louisiana. Been helping individuals and families now for 60 years. Also brought to you by Jerry Anderson, State Farm Insurance, by Learning RX, by Highland Place, Rehab and Nursing Center, by Jacob's Well, Inspirational Books and Gifts, and by Resilient House. Now, I've got a question for both of you.
Okay.
How do you deal with a pink elephant?
Oh, gosh. Maybe get some sleep.
We're going to deal with a pink elephant this evening.
The pink elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the pink elephant is appearing a lot these days in religions. I mean, you open the newspaper, turn on the television, right? And so our life strategist this evening is Linda K Klein. She's got a brand new book out. We're going to talk about it this evening. It is The Pink Elephant. Pure. Inside the evangelical movement that shamed a generation of young women and how I broke free. Linda K. Klein is our life She's not the pink elephant, but I think she's going to talk about the pink elephant this evening as we move on. We don't ever shy away. We can't shy away from the pink elephant, can we?
Is pink elephant the SEX word?
Well, I think we'll ask Linda Kay, but I would imagine you could say sex on the radio.
Oh,
you really
can?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, I didn't want Ruben to beat me. I made it through last night without being beeped.
What did you do to her last night?
I know, right? She's being all cautious.
We'll be back. If we're talking addiction prevention, Welcome back. Welcome back into 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. Welcome back into Strategies for Living. PLPC, Carla McCormick, marriage and family therapist David McMillan. It just seems like yesterday. I mean, the 1990s, maybe I'm showing my age here, but there was a whole industry that emerged. The purity industry emerged out of largely the white evangelical Christian culture. You remember purity rings?
I do.
Yeah, you remember purity pledges and purity balls. Well, all of that, had a message to it. A pretty dangerous message, and that is girls are potential sexual stumbling blocks for boys and for men, and any expression of a girl's sexuality could reflect the corruption of her character. And this message traumatized a lot of young ladies. And what resulted was anxiety, fear, experiences that actually mimicked symptoms of PTSD. So let's welcome to the program our life strategist this evening, who has acknowledged the pink elephant and written about it. She is Linda K Klein. She's the founder of Break Free Together. She earned a master's degree from New York University, focused on American evangelical Christian gender and sexuality messaging for girls, and has spent over a decade working at the cross-section of faith, gender, and social change. She is a Midwesterner at heart, but she now lives in New York City. So we welcome Linda K Klein to Strategies for Living. Miss Klein, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Glad you are here, and glad you're willing to talk this talk. So, Pure is the book. Follows your journey, right? Your journey of healing. You had a gender-based shame, you say, in growing up in the American evangelical Christian church, right?
Yes, very much. Yeah, and you really described it quite well in your introduction. I really grew up believing and learning, being taught that there were two types of girls and women, those who were pure and those who were impure. And, we could be considered less pure based on our own sexual thoughts and feelings and behaviors, but also on the sexual thoughts and behaviors of men in the community toward us, for which we were often blamed based on how we dressed.
And of course, you had nothing to do with what they did or didn't do.
I certainly don't believe that I had anything to do with it. No, but that's the trick, right? That in a culture where you're taught that women and girls are the holders of sexual purity, you get into a habit of blaming girls and women for the sexual thoughts and feelings of men and boys, which, of course, is a very dangerous way of looking at the world that can lead to some pretty scary roads depending on what happens.
Now let's talk a little bit about how deeply this was ingrained into you. I had to read this a couple of times, Linda Kay. So you were a virgin, you knew you were a virgin, and yet you'd go get pregnancy tests, and you would take pregnancy tests.
I understand. I understand why you had to read it twice. And the truth is that it made me feel like something was really wrong with me as well, because I had the same reaction that you're having right now.
Yeah.
I was a smart girl. I knew that if you don't have sex, you don't get pregnant.
Yeah.
And yet I had such a fear, such an anxiety about the sexual exploration that I had undergone, that I felt this feeling that someone was going to find out somehow, and that I would ultimately be, the sky would fall. And the way that it seemed most likely that the sky might fall, or most threatening that the sky might fall, is that I would become pregnant. And the community that I had actually recently left, I had actually even recently left the evangelical community and rejected the sexual shaming I'd been raised with. And yet I still felt a deep desperation to be approved of in the community. And that was really when I started to understand just how deep the sexual shaming had gotten inside of me. Even though I had left, even though I intellectually didn't think that this made sense, still the anxiety was there and driving me to do things that felt nonsensical even to me.
Hey, Jessica, how does what you experienced and as you study this, how does what happened in the 90s relate to, let's say, me growing up in the 70s in Catholic church with nuns? I can vividly remember the nuns pulling us to the side and telling us, girls, if you can get the milk for free, why buy the cow? And it's your job to hold the reins. And basically, kind of, feels like to me the same thing. I guess my question is, how was what happened in the 90s different from that, or was it?
That's such a great question. The purity teachings are not new, and sexual shaming is certainly not exclusive to the evangelical church. This is a very long-standing cultural problem. Really, gender imbalance and sexual control is a global issue. It's embedded into American culture. But what really happened in the early 1990s is that the evangelical culture really ratcheted it up by creating this purity movement that quickly became a purity industry, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show.
They kind of branded it and marketed it. That was the deal.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And what I think a really great illustration of how this manifested that in terms of products is that there was the development of purity-themed Bibles. So you have a purity-themed Bible. One of them has 60 pages of non-biblical material that's entirely dedicated to the importance of preserving your sexual purity, with rules like avoid the horizontal. So just imagine growing up in a culture where, your faith is your life, and 1/6 of your Bible is about how important it is for you to remain sexually pure. It's very difficult not to begin to conflate your sexuality and your salvation.
Yeah.
And so I would say it is a continuation of a long-standing story that had a very particular manifestation starting in the 90s.
Now, you even broke up with a boyfriend because you truly believed that would be pleasing to God, right?
Yeah, the way that I was thinking about it then was that it would be pleasing to God. The way that I think about it now, looking back on those days, is that I was utterly terrified. The truth is that I was crazy about my boyfriend, and it brought out all of these sexual feelings in me. And even though all he and I were doing was kissing, it was enough to make me stir inside. And it didn't just stir my passion; it stirred my shame.
Yeah.
And really, that is what led me to break up with him, really in an attempt to protect myself, and moreover to protect him, because I was taught that was my job, to protect men and boys from the threat that was my body.
Your job to keep you pure and keep him pure and keep everybody pure.
That's right.
Yeah.
And if he lusted after you, it was your fault.
Yeah, that's the narrative, unfortunately. And oftentimes these narratives are so deeply embedded that they come out in subtle ways. So you might not necessarily have someone pull you aside and say, you are responsible for sexual purity, although that certainly was said in just as overt messaging as that. But you also got the message more often in subtle ways. So, for example, that stumbling block reference that you made earlier, oftentimes when I was pulled aside growing up, I was called a stumbling block, literally a thing over which men and boys could trip on their way to God. So there's this objectification that even happens as this happens, and essentially, the anxiety that you feel as a young person, constantly wondering what you might do that might make you a threat, is crazy making.
Now, I think it's important to put the frame around this, Linda Kay, that, and I'm not being overly dramatic here, if I'm reading and understanding right, this damn near killed you, because you started, you had some intense abdominal pain, and rather than ask for help, to prove that you were a woman of the spirit, not of the flesh. You eventually were diagnosed with Crohn's disease and anxiety, and you link that to directly the church's teachings, and wow, what a toll that took on you.
Mm. You know, it's just very old teachings that are embedded into our culture that came up in my religious upbringing as well. You know, this idea that the body is earthly and is at best not as good as the spirit or the mind, and at worst a threat to the spirit and the mind. These are the kinds of ideas I grew up with. And, you know, many of us did. It dates all the way back to Greco-Roman culture when you have Plato and Aristotle talking about how the intellect, the sphere of the intellect is better than the physical sphere. But for me, I took that very, very seriously as someone who, you know, also had all of these sexuality teachings and the threat of the body, you know, wrapped up in that idea of the body as a something that needed to be conquered, essentially. And I remember when I went to doctors and I started telling them what I was experiencing and about the pain that I was experiencing, you know, I was dismissed, as quite frankly many women and particularly young women are when they go to doctors and talk about pain. And so it wasn't a unique experience. What was unique was my reaction to that. My reaction to that, to having someone in authority tell me, you know, you shouldn't be complaining so much, things aren't so bad, was for me to say, oh, I need to conquer my body better. You know, I need to stop putting so much attention into getting better and put more attention into suffering better.
I just need I need to pray harder. I need to try harder. I need to do better. Any of that. Wow.
Exactly. Exactly. And then, you know, eventually it became life-threatening, which was an absolute shock for me about, you know, and a real wake-up call.
We're talking to Linda K. Klein. The book is Pure: Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women, and how Linda K. broke free. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about shame. We talk about shame a lot on this program, but I think we're going to talk about shame and the prominence of shame in a very unique way. Stay with us. Linda K. Klein today on Strategies.
You might even hang up the phone. But you see, it really doesn't make any difference.
Addiction takes a Welcome back. Welcome back into 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. Welcome back into Strategies for Living. I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan, PLPC Carla McCormick, our life strategist today, Linda K Klein, the author of Pure, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women, How I Broke Free. It's out at your favorite bookseller from Touchstone. You had to be, Linda K, you had to be exhausted by this level of scrutiny. Did it ever feel like you were living in a glass house or something?
That's actually a great description. That's exactly right. And because your purity was determined by other people, not by you,
Yeah.
it was really the community's assessment of your purity that deemed you either pure or impure.
Yeah.
I felt in a constant state of wondering when what sexual thought or feeling or what I wore or how I talked or what it might be next that I would be pulled aside and talked to about that would be a manifestation of people's perception of my impurity, which in this community is no small thing. If you are impure, you are you should not expect any good Christian man to ever love you, is really the teaching. You should consider yourself lucky if you are loved and able to function in the community in that way, which is exactly what's expected of you, to function in the community in that way.
So one of the things that Carla and I have found ourselves talking a lot about in this daily radio program is, I don't think there's a week that goes by, and sometimes we do it multiple times a week, is we talk about shame, Linda K. And I know that you felt that. But you started at some point, you started to rethink how you were approaching your faith. How did that happen? How did you come to that place of rethinking this approach?
Shame is what drove me out of the institution, the evangelical institution, and what drove me out of the evangelical church. And when I first left evangelicalism, I was under the impression that I would no longer have access to God, because that is what I had learned in the community.
Mm-hmm.
You had to believe in a very specific way in order to access God.
Right.
And so it was with great sadness that I left. It was really a tragedy in my life in many ways. But the feeling that God was still there with me didn't go away. I still felt God's presence. I still felt in relationship with God just as much as I had when I was in the community. And over time, I started to give myself permission to believe that God was still there and still wanted to be in community with me, even if I wasn't adhering to all of the community's rules, this community in which I had first accessed God. And that was the beginning, coming to reevaluate what I had learned about God and to trust the God that I knew, to trust the God that I was in relationship with, and to trust what I had experienced over what I was told I was supposed to experience.
Yeah. So at some point you reached out to other young women, right? You started to talk to people from home, right? And you just simply asked them how they were coping with this shame-induced issues, if they were, right?
Yes, that's exactly how it began. I was feeling scared. I was feeling like an anomaly. I was feeling afraid that I would never be healthy or have a healthy relationship. There were no books that I could turn to or online communities that I could find. And so I went to the one place that I was finding some recognition. I went to the girls that I had been raised with in my church youth group. Because, we had started to have some intimate conversations. And the more that I was open with them and told them about what I was experiencing, I just sat then with my jaw dropped open as they told me incredibly similar stories from their own lives, these stories of sexual shame and fear and anxiety that for them, like me, were manifesting physically, for some of us in ways that mimic classic PTSD, as you referenced earlier.
Right. Now, you didn't stay home in your conversations, because what you did then is you took those conversations from home and you went out on a quest. In fact, it turned into, what, a dozen years, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, who knew when I started that quest that that's how long it was going to be? I certainly didn't. You know, the first thing I did was, having had a number of conversations with people over a number of years, I went back to my hometown. I called up all the now young women I had grown up with in my youth group that I could get a hold of, and I did a year of interviews with people I was raised with. And then from there, the similarities in so many of our stories really were the catalyst. It was the catalyst for me to say, okay, I need to understand how big this is. Okay, this is bigger than me, but I have a hunch that it's bigger than my community, in my hometown as well. And so I started talking with people who were raised in religious communities like my own around the country, and quickly learned that not only did I hear the same stories that people were taught around the country, or stories of lessons that people were taught around the country, so they were taught very similar things to what we were taught, but I also heard the same pain from people around the country, and the same physical manifestations of that pain in many cases.
How important was all of that conversation, that quest, took you across the country? How important do you think that was to your healing, Linda Kay?
It was the number one most central part of my healing experience. I mean, I essentially put myself through 12 years of narrative therapy.
Yeah.
I just kept repeating my story over and over to people, and then listening as people told me stories, that reflected my story. The details were different, but the core messages were the same. And that experience of a story exchange, which is really what was happening. I do use this term interviewer, interviewee, and that was true. But, another thing was true as well, and that is that I was a fellow sufferer. I was a fellow wanderer, and we really exchanged stories in a way that I think is the reason that ultimately I was able to heal. And a number of my interviewees said that it did the same for them.
How prevalent, how prominent is shame, do you think? Especially within our country's religious context, particularly when we're talking about sexual ethics, and how prevalent is that, do you think?
Well, the research shows that the more that we direct our attention towards something, the more likely it is that we are to, experience what our attention is directed towards. So when our attention is directed towards shame and having a shame response, we're more likely to have a shame response ourselves. So what I've found is that the evangelical teachings around purity, which, as I said before, are not exclusive to evangelicalism, to your point about Catholicism and really just to our culture at large,
right,
are shaming in their core. So I'll give you an example. You all talk about shame regularly, so I will not go too far into this because I know that your audience is quite familiar with shame. But when I say shame, I'm not talking about bashfulness or shyness. I'm really talking about the research definition of shame, this feeling I am something bad or people will think that I am something bad.
Right.
It's a totalizing idea.
Right.
And really when you look at these sexuality education teachings that we're getting in purity culture, where this is essentially a shaming teaching. We're teaching people you are pure or you are impure. You are a good girl or you're a bad girl. And we're not talking about whether or not you're volunteering when we say that, right?
Right.
Right. We're talking about your sexual life. We are defining people in their totality, in their humanhood, based on one thing about them, other people's perception of their sexuality. And so I think it's actually quite prevalent for people to experience sexual shame because we are actually training people to experience sexual shame through our language, through how we treat people. We are speaking the language of shame, and we are acting in the model of shame over and over and over.
Linda, as women, and when you work with young girls, how do you break the cycle? How do you crack that shell of shame that has been put around them?
In my experience, I don't think that we can crack it alone. I really think this only happens in community. It really is about resisting what shame wants you to do, which is disconnect and hide and not tell people what you're experiencing, and instead coming into voice and, being able to have that story exchange that I experienced and that so many of my interviewees experienced. So the nonprofit that I started that you all referenced at the beginning of the program, one of the core things that we're working on is to really create spaces for people to be able to come into story. And one of the ways that we're doing that is just by offering a hashtag. If you're ready to come into voice online, which is a big thing to do, it's a risky thing to do, but if you're ready to talk a little bit about this online, you can use the Break Free Together hashtag to be able to find other people who are struggling and suffering so that we can begin the process of community healing.
Another part of the elephant in the room, and this may make some listeners shift a bit in their chairs, but abstinence only before marriage resources got federal support. I mean, it got it, and so that those resources took that evangelical purity message, and it took it into literally public schools, and therefore into mainstream culture. Did it not?
It did indeed, yes. Before we had a significant amount of federal funding for abstinence only before marriage curriculum, a lot of the curriculum was actually a religious curriculum that was being taught locally. And when we suddenly had, more and more money with each several years, to the point where eventually we had $2 billion that have gone toward abstinence only before marriage messaging. Some of those folks who were previously using lessons in communities like my own, religious communities like my own, brought those messages to public schools and to community-based organizations and other places with federal funding. So even though when they're in those places, they're not supposed to have a religious content to them, the same lessons that I grew up learning in church, other people have told me stories of hearing in youth group, or rather in their schools. Stories that I learned in youth group, they learned in schools. Perhaps I can give you just one example.
Let's do this. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll start with an example. How about that?
Perfect.
All right. Linda K Klein is our life strategist this evening. She's the author of Pure: Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women. How I Broke Free, out from Touchstone at your favorite bookseller. Is there a connection? Is there a connection between this purity culture and the rape culture?
Of course there
We'll
is.
we'll explore that. We'll explore that when we come back.
Before the day I met you, life was so unkind, but you're the key to my peace of mind, because you make me feel.
Where you go from Welcome back. Welcome back into 101.7 FM and 710 Keel. Welcome back into Strategies for Living, Marriage, and Family Therapist David McMillan and PLPC Carla McCormick with Our Life Strategist, the author of Pure, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women, Linda K. Klein. How you doing down there, Carla?
I'm angry.
You pissed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, this brings back so many emotions, and so, you know, I deal with clients every day who, you know, have been abused. And you before we went to break, you said, "What does this have to do with the rape culture?"
Yeah, I just asked the question: is there a connection? What do you think, Linda K?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, in purity culture, you learn that men and boys are easily sexually tempted, and women and girls are responsible for protecting men and boys from the temptation that is their bodies by being pure, that is, never being seductive in any way, wearing the right thing, acting in the right way. You know, and it's believed that if women and girls will just do that, then everyone will be safe. No one will be sexually touched in any way, including sexual violation. And that logic leads people, when a woman or girl is violated, to look for how she might have been impure. You know, was she wearing something revealing? Was she drinking? You know, what was it that she did that allowed for this sexual experience to happen? And embedded in that is the categorization of sexual violence as sex. And really, it really is an entirely different thing. It is violence. But we assess sexual violence oftentimes by the same rules as we do consensual sex.
Well, we talked. I mean, you talked earlier about the kind of mixed messages that girls receive. You know, be strong, be a strong woman. But you know, when my girls went to college, you know, they had a whole seminar on how to stay safe on campus and how to basically not get raped. You know, well, they should have a class teaching boys why they shouldn't rape. You know, I mean, it shouldn't be my girl's job to learn how not to get raped. I think something's wrong with the approach.
I completely agree. I actually used to lead sessions for college students where I would speak to sororities and fraternities and talk to them about safety and sexual violence. And I always thought it was really fascinating when you would go into a woman's dorm or into a sorority. You know, everybody in the room was like, "This is old hat. We've heard it a million times before. Yeah. We know all about it. Hold our keys like this. You know, don't walk in dark alleys." And when we would go in and talk with a men's group, you know, it was there that we experienced transformation, because in many cases I was under the impression that this was the first time that anybody had ever talked to them about sexual violence before. You know, so over the course of our hour with them, they would start out by, you know, being really inappropriate, making inappropriate jokes, you know, fiddling a lot. And by the end, you could tell that some people in the room were like, "Oh, wait, we actually need to deal with this. This is a problem." And it was incredible to see, you know, that they hadn't really been talked to about it before.
Right. Now, one of the things that I really like that you did in this book, Linda K, in Pure, you don't just church bash, because you give examples. There are churches that they're out looking for healthier models as we speak, are they not?
Absolutely. There are even evangelical churches
That's what I mean.
that are out
Yeah.
looking for healthier models. Yes. And I profile a couple of them in the book that I think are particularly inspiring.
So what does that look like? What would a healthy sexual ethic, sex education, what would that look like within a church?
It might be best for me to use a metaphor. So when I was growing up, I was given one tool, metaphorically speaking. I was given a ruler, you know, and on that ruler was a line that I was not allowed to cross. And if I crossed it, I lost my purity. It was always unclear where that line was. Everybody had a different definition of where that line was. But, you know, that was my only tool for making sexual decisions, including protecting myself from sexual violence. How useful is that ruler when I, find myself very uncomfortable with someone that I trust, but who's making me feel like perhaps I could be in danger? It's not useful at all. How useful is that ruler after I'm married? How useful is that ruler after I've been deemed impure? Completely useless. So ultimately, people are left with no tools at all. So I find that the much more useful tool is almost like a Swiss Army knife of values and reflective processes that people can go through that they can use in multiple different settings. So I'm really inspired by the churches that are teaching values, which are embedded into our religions. We go to church often, many times, in order to remain in alignment with our values. And yet we learn how to use those values in any number of areas in our life, how we treat our coworkers, how we treat our children, so on and so forth. But we don't learn how to use those values in our sexual lives because there's so much sexual shame that we don't talk about that.
Yeah.
So I really love these models that are teaching people, to identify values and to use those values to make developmentally appropriate decisions.
And there are church leaders out there, there are pastors out there who get it, who recognize
Absolutely.
the damage that's been done by this purity culture, and they are front line, along with you, helping develop some tools that help people heal from the shame, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, sometimes I really feel like there's a bit of a disconnect between the people who are on the ground. And when I say the people on the ground, I do mean people in the pews who are showing up, in religious community week after week. But I also mean the people who see those individuals week after week, pastors, chaplains, youth pastors. These people see the shame and they feel the shame, and they recognize oftentimes the complicity of the church in contributing to that shame. So even when we're not hearing from the celebrities, the religious celebrities, or the the spokespeople, the sort of talking heads, anything about this, that doesn't mean that people on the ground aren't aware of it and aren't each in their own way trying to find some way to make peace with it and to help people.
This is a hope-filled book. It's actually a call to action, and a lighthouse, if you will. For any who have experienced any kind of religious based shame. Again, I come back to the pink elephant. I mean, the Catholic Church is having to deal with that big time over the last several decades, and it's our secrets that make us sick and keep us sick.
When shame lives in the dark.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. So, I Linda Kay, I think I know this is it was probably uncomfortable for you to tell some of these stories. And some they're very frank. Some of them are funny. Some of them are disturbing. They're personal. And you share conversations with other women who were raised in this same culture. And so, kudos to you for the courage. My goodness.
Thank you so much.
Linda K Klein is our life strategist. We're going to come back. We've got a few more minutes with her as we continue with strategies for living. But if you want to continue the conversation with Linda Kay, get to your bookseller. Wherever you buy books, get a copy of Pure out from Touchstone. We'll be back. More strategies with Linda K Klein today.
American woman,
Guess
stay
who?
away from me.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Are you going to call me a radio nerd again?
No.
No. Okay. 101.7 FM and 17 kilo. But Ruben is.
Ruben is
Yeah.
definitely a radio nerd.
Welcome back into Strategies for Living, marriage and family therapist David McMillan and PLPC Carla McCormick with Linda K. Klein, the author of Pure, at your favorite bookseller right now, out from Touchstone. There's a lot that you could pull out of this book, Linda K. Carla may have pulled something out. What I pulled out of it was that healing is possible, but you have to you have to face it. You have to reclaim your sexual self and therefore your whole self. That's what I pulled out of it.
I'm so glad that's what you pulled out of it. That really is the message that I want to convey. I think that hope really comes with exactly what you said. I love that phrasing, claiming ourselves, saying, you are mine.
Your whole
I'm not
self,
going to
though.
reject any part of you. Yes,
Your
exactly.
whole
I'm
self.
not going to reject any part.
And and this may make some of us uncomfortable, but we use the term holy. We call God holy, and where does that term come from? It comes from the whole. God is whole. He's all, the everything. And that may make some of us shift.
Well, and I guess what I get out of it is that there are lots of women and lots of people suffering and feeling the same thing. So you're not alone, and just because you went through something and you had trouble with your spirituality and your teaching doesn't mean that you have to abandon God or religion. That there is a way to get to the truth that that in your relationship with God, so to speak. I mean, there are other ways out there.
Yeah, and the truth will set you free.
Yes, sir.
I love
we
it.
hope.
Linda Kate, thank you so much for this book. Thank you for your courage, and thank you for coming and being a great life strategist for us here on Strategies for Living.
This is a pleasure.
Great job.
This is an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Carla, you've done it again.
She did it.
Ruben, you've done it. You've done it again. And folks, you've done it again. Thank you for tuning into Strategies for Living. We've been presented by CADA, the Council on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse of Northwest Louisiana. Been helping individuals and families for 60 years now. We're also brought to you by Jerry Anderson, State Farm Insurance, by Learning RX, by Highland Place, Rehab and Nursing Center, by Jacob's Well, Inspirational Books and Gifts, and by Resilient House. If today were the last day of your life, you only had one more phone call to make, who would you call? What would you say? And why are you waiting? Make the call. For PLPC Carla McCormick, for Ruben Wright, and for Linda K. Klein, I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan. See you next time here on Strategies for Living.
Breaking news and trending talk. This is 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. KEEL and trending talk. This is 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. KEEL. Report.
Reveal yourself or resign. I'm Lisa Lacera, Fox News.